example, with Cambodia, where there was acreage of things, that this was a communist atrocity, whereas the other was not a communist atrocity. Well, I got quite interested in this, and I went to talk to the then deputy foreign editor of the Times. And I said, you know, we've had very poor coverage on this. And he said, you're absolutely right. There are a dozen atrocities around the world that we don't cover. This is one for various reasons. So I took it up.
I was working as a reporter and writer for a small alternative radio program in upstate New York, and we received audio tapes of interviews with Timorese leaders, and we were quite surprised that, given the level of American involvement, that there was not more coverage, indeed practically any coverage, of the large-scale Indonesian killing in the mainstream American media. We formed a small group of people to try to monitor this situation and see what we could do over time to alert public opinion to what was actually happening in East Timor.
There were literally about half a dozen people who simply dedicated themselves with great commitment to getting the story to break through. And they reached a couple of people in Congress. They got to me, for example. I was able to testify at the UN and write some things. They kept at it, kept at it, kept at it. Whatever is known about the subject essentially comes from their work. There's not much else.
I wrote first an editorial called An Unjust War in East Timor. It had a map, and it said exactly what had happened. We then ran a dozen other editorials on it. They were read, they were entered in the congressional record, and several congressmen then took up the cause, and then something was done in Congress as a result of this.
The fact that the editorial page of the New York Times on Christmas Eve published that editorial put our work on a very different level, and it gave a great deal of legitimacy to something that we were trying to advance for a long time, and that was the idea and the reality that a major tragedy was unfolding in East Timor.
If one takes literally the various theories that Professor Chomsky puts out, one would feel that there is a tacit conspiracy between the establishment press and the government in Washington to focus on certain things and ignore certain things, so that if we broke the rules, that we would instantly get a reaction, a sharp reaction from the overlords in Washington, who would say, hey, what are you doing speaking up on East Timor? We're trying to keep that quiet. We didn't hear a thing. What we did hear, and this was quite interesting, is that there was a guy named Arnold Cohn, and he became a one-person lobby.
I appreciate the nice things that Karl Meyer said about me in his interview, but I object to the notion that a one-man lobby was formed or anything like that. I think that if there weren't a large network composed of the American Catholic Bishops' Conference, composed of other church groups, composed of human rights groups, composed of simply concerned citizens and others, and a network of concern within the news media, I think that it would have been impossible to do anything at all at any time, and it certainly would have been impossible to sustain things for as long as they've been sustained.
Professor Chomsky and a lot of people who engage in this kind of press analysis have one thing in common. Most of them have never worked for a newspaper. Many of them know very little about how newspapers work.
When Chomsky came around, he had with him a file of all the coverage in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other papers of East Timor. And he would go to the meticulous degree that if, for example, the London Times had a piece on East Timor, and then it appeared in the New York Times, that if a paragraph was cut out, he'd compare and he'd say, look, this key paragraph right near the end, which is really what tells the whole story, was left out of the New York Times version of the London Times thing.
There was a story in the London Times which is pretty accurate. The New York Times revised it radically. Didn't just leave a paragraph out. They revised it and gave it a totally different cast. It was then picked up by Newsweek, giving it the New York Times cast. It ended up being a whitewash, whereas the original was an atrocity story.
So I said to Chomsky at the time, I said, well, it may be that you're misinterpreting ignorance, haste, deadline pressure, etc., for some kind of determined effort to suppress an element of the story.
He said, well, if it happened once or twice or three times, I might agree with you. But if it happens a dozen times, Mr. Meyer, I think there's something else at work.
And it's not a matter of happening 1 time, 2 times, 5 times, 100 times. It happened all the time.
I said, Professor Chomsky, having been in this business, it happens a dozen times. These are very imperfect institutions.
When they did give coverage, it was from the point of view of, it was a whitewash of the United States. Now, you know, that's not an error. That's systematic, consistent behavior, in this case, without even any exception.
This is a much more subtle process than you get in the kind of the sledgehammer rhetoric of the people that make a to B equation between what the government does, what people think, and what newspapers say. That sometimes what the Times does can make an enormous difference. At other times, it has no influence whatsoever.
So one of the greatest tragedies of our age is still happening in East Timor. The Indonesians have killed up to 1/3 of the population. They're in concentration camps. They conduct large-scale military campaigns against the people who are resisting. Campaigns with names like Operation Eradicate or Operation Clean Sweep. Timorese women are subjected to a forced birth control program. In addition, they're bringing in a constant stream of Indonesian settlers to take over the land. Whenever people are brave enough to take to the streets in demonstrations or show the least sign of resistance, they just massacre them. It's sort of like Indonesia. If we allow them to continue to stay in East Timor, the international community, they will simply digest East Timor and turn it into, trying to turn it into cash crop.
I mean, this is way beyond just demonstrating the subservience of the media to power. I mean, they have real complicity in genocide in this case. The reason that the atrocities can go on is because nobody knows about them. If anyone knew about them, there'd be protests and pressure to stop them. So therefore, by suppressing the facts, the media are making a major contribution to some of the, probably the worst act of genocide since the Holocaust.
You say that what the media do is to ignore certain kinds of atrocities that are committed by us and our friends, and to play up enormously atrocities that are committed by them and our enemies. And you posit that there's a test of integrity and moral honesty, which is to have a kind of equality of treatment of corpses.
Equality of principles.
I mean, that every dead person should be in principle equal to every other dead person.
That's not what I say at all.
Well, I'm glad that's not what you say, because in fact, that's not what you do.
Of course it's not what I do, nor would I say it.
That's right.
In fact, I say the opposite. What I say is that we should be responsible for our own actions primarily.
Because your method is not only to ignore the corpses created by them, but also to ignore corpses that are created by neither side, but which are irrelevant to your ideological
That's
agenda.
totally untrue.
Well, let me give you an example. Okay. One of your own causes that you take very seriously is the cause of the Palestinians, and a Palestinian corpse weighs very heavily on your conscience, and yet a Kurdish corpse does not.
That's not true at all. I've been involved in Kurdish support groups for years. That's absolutely true. That's absolutely false. I mean, just ask the Kurdish, ask the people who are involved in, I mean, you know, they come to me, I sign their petitions and so on and so forth. In fact, if you look at the things we've written, I mean, let's take a look. I mean, I'm not Amnesty International. I can't do everything. I'm a single person. But if you read, say, take a look, say, at the book that Edward Herman and I wrote on this topic. In it, we discuss 3 kinds of atrocities. What we called benign bloodbaths, which nobody cares about, constructive bloodbaths, which are the ones we like, and nefarious bloodbaths, which are the ones that the bad guys do. The principle that I think we ought to follow is not the one that you stated. You know, it's a very simple ethical point. You're responsible for the predictable consequences of your actions. You're not responsible for the predictable consequences of somebody else's actions. The most important thing for me and for you is to think about the consequences of your actions. What can you affect? These are the things to keep in mind. These are not just academic exercises. We're not analyzing the media on Mars or in the 18th century or something like that. We're dealing with real human beings who are suffering and dying and being tortured and starving because of policies that we are involved in. we as citizens of democratic societies are directly involved in and are responsible for. And what the media are doing is ensuring that we do not act on our responsibilities and that the interests of power are served, not the needs of the suffering people, and not even the needs of the American people, who would be horrified if they realized the blood that's dripping from their hands because of the way they're allowing themselves to be deluded and manipulated by the system. What about the third world? Well, despite everything, and it's pretty ugly and awful, these struggles are not over. The struggle for freedom and independence never is completely over. Their courage, in fact, is really remarkable and amazing. I've personally had the privilege, and it is a privilege, of witnessing it a few times in villages in Southeast Asia and Central America, and recently in the occupied West Bank, and it is astonishing to see.
And it's always amazing, at least to me it's amazing, I can't understand it. It's also very moving and very inspiring. In fact, it's kind of awe-inspiring. Now, they rely very crucially on a very slim margin for survival that's provided by dissidence and turbulence within the imperial societies. And how large that margin is for us to determine.